welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. My name is Gemma Friedman. I work on business and human rights in UNISON's international unit, and I'm a board member of Electronics Watch. UNISON affiliated as the only non-public sector organisation to Electronics Watch to help us to walk our talk a few years back. We are a public sector trade union with nearly 1.4 million members, 70% of whom I'm proud to say are women, and a few thousand of our members work in public procurement across the United Kingdom. Our members join UNISON because they want rights at work and decent pay for a decent life, but many of our members don't just want that for themselves. They want it for all workers everywhere. And they've told us that they don't want to use electronic or other equipment at work stained by workers' exploitation. And our research shows that public service institutions do want to procure sustainably, but it's extremely challenging to genuinely improve the rights of workers in supply chains alone. We believe that Electronics Watch offers a unique and effective solution. So this webinar is part of a program of work to support this journey. It's going to last for an hour. It's a public meeting and it will be recorded. If you have any questions or want Electronics Watch to get in touch with you for a chat, please use the chat function and Peter Policki will reply to you. I'd like to thank all the speakers in advance, our host, yourselves for attending, and that's enough from me. Over to our host, Andy, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Davies. I'm procurement manager at the Natural History Museum in London, which is very proud to be an affiliate of Electronics Watch. I'm a trustee of Electronics Watch. I'm also a trade union member, and I've been in public procurement for the best part of 34 years now here in the United Kingdom. And I mention I'm also a trustee of Electronics Watch, didn't I? I think so. Electronics Watch is, let me talk a little bit about Electronics Watch to kick us off. It's an independent monitoring organisation. Currently, over 300 public buyers in Europe and Australia have affiliated to protect workers' rights in their electronic supply chains. Electronics Watch is working together with local civil society organisations and trade unions in production countries to monitor the factories that assemble the laptops, smartphones, servers and switches that affiliates buy. These monitoring partners have a trust-based relationship with workers. They interview them, making sure to give them space and time to voice their grievances. Workers know best what goes wrong in their factory and how this harms them. The collected data results in reports that are being shared with the brands and the manufacturers to start a factory improvement process. Affiliates also receive detailed reports. The leverage that public buyers have as big buyers, and because they're organised with the Electronics Watch network, drives these factory improvement processes. The partnership between an increasing number of public buyers give even small procurement organisations a much bigger leverage towards the industry. Linking procurement directly with the workers through the worker-driven monitoring opens up a grievance mechanism for workers that doesn't exist in these global supply chains outside of Electronics Watch. So let's now see how procurement and sustainability experts utilize Electronics Watch expertise in their organization. And I'm going to invite each of our panel members to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with you, Tim.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Tim Rudin, and I lead responsible procurement team for the Greater London Authority, and that's all of the bodies that work under the Mayor of London. So that includes Transport for London, which you might hear a bit more about today, also the Metropolitan Police Service, the London Fire Brigade, London Legacy Development Corporation, which runs the Olympic Park, another development corporation in the northwest of London, and City Hall itself. Spend is around sort of £7 or £8 billion a year in total.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. Mercè, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Andy. My name is Mercè. I am attorney of the Catalan government. since 1998, more or less. And since 2016, I am the General Director of Public Procurement of the Regional Government of Catalonia, of the Catalan government. So I am member of affiliated to Electronic Watch from 1 year ago, more or less. And so I will share this time with you. Thank you.
Thanks, and welcome to you too. Pauline?
Hi, everybody. Hi. I have for the last, I think, 9 years now worked as a national coordinator for the Swedish regions work on sustainable public procurement, and basically the 21 Swedish regions responsible for public health and public transportation. So yeah, and we've been affiliated members since, I think it's 2015, so long time.
Great. And that's our international panel of affiliates. I just would like to invite my Electronics Watch colleagues to introduce themselves as well. We're going to be hearing from them a little bit later on. Harpreet, would you like to say hello?
Hi, my name is Harpreet. I qualified as a solicitor in 2010 and worked in various different charities and NGOs in human rights advocacy and litigation, joining Electronics Watch in some capacity in 2016 and formally just a couple of weeks ago. So I've been working as a consultant until then. I'm the newest staff member.
Great. And finally, last but by no means least, our director, Björn Claeson. Björn, hello.
Hi, Andy, and thank you for the welcome. My name is Björn Claeson. I'm director of Electronics Watch, as Andy just said.
Great, thanks. We're going to start by talking about support from Electronics Watch. Tim, can I come to you first? As you say, you're working at the Greater London Authority, and public sector bodies in the United Kingdom have very specific requirements regarding modern slavery and sustainability. How does Electronics Watch help you achieve these requirements?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so transparency is really key, and I know we'll talk about that a bit more. But as you say, we've now, for a number of years now, we're issuing modern slavery statements. So there's plenty of public scrutiny and quite a bit of legislation more recently, and actually, we expect that to increase quite significantly potentially with the changes in the procurement side, changes in what will now be UK procurement regulations. So partnering with Electronics Watch really helps us to fulfil some statutory requirements, which is really important. But certainly above and beyond that, it's a very political organisation. The Mayor of London is a figure who's subject to quite a lot of political scrutiny, as well as scrutiny by the press, certainly in London and UK wide. And this is the area of human rights in our supply chains. The effect that the money that we're spending has globally is one of those areas that gets a lot of scrutiny. So partnering with Electronics Watch demonstrates the fact that we take these issues seriously, first of all, and that's really worthwhile. But then actually, what can we do specifically? So what are we able to actually understand about what's going on in our electronic supply chains, and then what impact can we have on those? And on our own, maybe not so much. So partnering with Electronics Watch, and then the power that collective weight from all the affiliates in the organisation, and that's growing all the time, is incredibly powerful, and really allows us to lend our voice to that much wider collective group, which can actually have, first of all, the ability to actually get much more detailed information, understanding about what's going on in places that might be on the other side of the world. That's what we're not sort of resourced to go visit ourselves, and then also to actually kind of effect change much more so than we could do on our own, and that in turn allows us to respond to that scrutiny, to a sort of report back through political channels and occasionally in the press as well, that we're actually acting on these issues.
Great, but Mercè, let me come to you. You represent the Catalan government. How does your government think about linking those strategic sustainability goals, especially in the area of social standards, with public procurement? How is it done over where you are?
Okay, promoting sustainable public procurement has been an important economic policy of the Catalan government for the last 3-4 years. But we have worked with many social clauses, introducing them into our contracts. And for example, in regard of social clauses, we have introduced some examples are the hiring of unemployed people, for example, or stable hiring, or with better working conditions according with the sectorial agreements. We have introduced also some clauses in order of gender equality, for example, or other clauses about environmental clauses also, and innovation clauses. So for the Catalan government, this is very important, the sustainable public procurement. But in the last years, we start to think how to improve, how to introduce another kind of clauses to have more impact on our public procurement. And we start to think of a more global perspective, to introduce a more global perspective linked with ethical clauses, respect for human rights, or this kind of clauses to have impact on public procurement, but out of our borders also. To go to the origin, to go to the manufacturing process, and to make transparent all the supplying chains of the, for example, electronic products or another. So we think that the affiliation to electronic watch was a big opportunity to increase our perspective, to have a more global impact. And so we decided to make this affiliation and to put in order all the process to make it possible. Thank you.
That's great, thanks. Pauline, now in Sweden, you've been working on topics of socially responsible public procurement for some time now, and you've very much been setting the bar really for the rest of Europe. Looking back, how do your perspectives from Sweden develop towards public procurement as an instrument for achieving those strategic goals that go beyond the typical procurement perspective?
Right, yeah. I mean, for us, it all started with a media scandal back in 2007. It was a Swedish watchdog that found that we were using, our suppliers were using child labor in Pakistan when they were producing our surgical instruments, and obviously, I think the realization for our politicians and also for public procurement officers that obviously, I mean, we cannot conduct healthcare in Sweden if it's to the detriment of people's health in other countries. But at the time in 2007, there were like no expectations that public procurement should solve all this. And it was even questioned whether this was legal. But I think over the years, this has become realizing that public procurement can be a very, very important political tool to reach all these goals and minimize risk of human rights violation, labor rights violation in our supply chains, because obviously our tax money should not go to suppliers that are violating all these rights. So that's why it started, and as many has said, you know, although we as like 21 regions are procuring goods and services, I think to the amount of 13 billion euros a year, we are small buyers on a global scale. So by joining forces and by being affiliated to the electronics watch, I mean, we can achieve so much more when it comes to follow-ups, but also being an important speaking partners towards the IT sector. And I'm sure we're going to touch on that topic more during this hour.
Yeah, how does that manifest itself, Pauline? You know, what are the specific? Can you describe what the experience is like for your organisation and in the support you get from Electronics Watch, and how that helps you in practical terms?
No, but I think to begin, I mean, the organization of having on the ground organization that can be our ears and on the ground, that's I don't know how to describe it, but I mean, normally when we do follow-ups in other areas, we either we ask our suppliers to provide us with audit reports, for example, but this is a way of actually direct access to workers' voices without them being filtered and having like NDAs flying left, right, and center. So it's invaluable for us to have this type of information.
Yes. I can certainly speak from personal, my own personal experience at the museum here in London. We were able to, not only were we able to have access to those audit reports, but it's having the expert interpretation of those reports to sort of focus in on what the issues might actually be. And, and that means that I can communicate with our suppliers and say, in very practical terms, there's an issue at this particular factory that's manufacturing laptops for us, and which we'd like you to address, and just having that information. Information is such power, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Pauline. I want to move on, panel, to learning for other sectors from Electronics Watch. And I want to come back to you, Tim, if I may. As you know, Electronics Watch focuses on electronics supply chains, but public procurement, as you know, and for the Greater London Authority, you procure many goods and services, garments, vehicles, cleaning services, food, construction, you name it. What opportunities do you see, Tim, that those sectors could learn from the Electronics Watch model?
I think it's a really powerful model, and I hark back to sort of where we were before this, and the others on the call may have had similar conversations over the years. When for a very long time we've understood, I think collectively, that there's human rights issues, some very significant ones in electronic supply chains in the countries where plenty of these products are being manufactured. But there may have been a lot of will, but where was the way? Often we would attempt to embark on some discussions, and then it was always, well, we might be spending millions of pounds we are spending millions of pounds a year on desktop hardware, let's say, but for the the Dells and the Apples and whoever else in this world, it was a very small amount, and every time we try to initiate conversations, we get the sort of standardized response, and some of those organizations may be doing quite a lot of work in these areas, varies of course, but we would never be able to get any sort of bespoke information whatsoever. So it always felt like a closed door, and it always felt that we could get questions on these areas from the political side of things, and our hands are very much tied. So the fact that that's changing now is really powerful, and I think that there really is a lot of learning. I was kind of describing Electronics Watch in a meeting I was having with somebody who's fairly new to role at a senior level in sustainability in the GLA. And they're absolutely arrested by they weren't familiar with Electronics Watch already. They're more on the environment side, but absolutely arrested by the model and the potential opportunity that provides, and really keen to understand whether this sort of thing exists in other sectors and whether it can be expanded and I think about other spend categories where we spend a lot of money but have always felt we didn't have any leverage. And I think energy sourcing, we the underground obviously uses a tremendous amount of electricity, and there's a lot of plans on the way to decentralize that for environmental reasons. But traditionally, we're buying from one of the big energy providers, and we've never really been able to put any bespoke social value or requirements in there. We could choose to buy green electricity or not, and that was sort of it. And I wonder, this model of that area. But I think you mentioned garments and vehicles is a big one for us, because again, it's not even so much for us how much money we spend, but just the sort of the fact that Transport for London in the GLA is a transport organisation. So almost separate to the amount of money is a scrutiny, because transport is what we do. And the vehicle, we need to make sure that the vehicles we buy are strong environmentally, of course, but also in terms of ethical procurement. And again, it's an area where we don't necessarily have a lot of leverage with big international, multinational vehicle manufacturers. So I think it's a really powerful model, and keen to be involved in areas where it can expand both directly for Electronics Watch and sort of other sectors where it might be set up as well.
I know, Tim, that in Transport for London, which comes under the Greater London Authority umbrella, you've got some special arrangements under talking about garments. You've got uniforms for staff who work for Transport for London, and they're sourced from countries overseas. And I know that you use some different approaches to undertaking supply chain due diligence there. Are there any plans perhaps that bring in the kind of model that electronics does in terms of producing risk reports or interpreting factory audits for us? Do you think there's scope for that kind of introduction in garments, for example?
I think there is, because in garments, so the TFL uniforms are made in Bangladesh and China, so two areas where, you know, certainly there's a lot of history of challenges there in sort of the conditions in which these garments are manufactured. So we know there's a high risk, and so essentially we sort of need to do it ourselves, but we're not going over to those countries. So we ask our suppliers to have third-party independent audits conducted, and we review those via SEDEX. It's a bit resource intensive, and actually, you know, it's a day, you know, the auditor, independent auditors going in for a day, but we know that we know those of us kind of working in the sector, we know that there's a lot of challenges and criticisms around that sort of approach. So we ask our suppliers to take some capacity building programs. The supplier is going to be sourcing from a factory for 3 years or more, but, you know, invest in that area to provide training for the factory workers and you know, help them to understand their rights and ability to recourse. But yeah, I mean, it's quite resource intensive, and it can feel a little bit like we're on our own. We try to partner with other people who are sourcing, but you know, even if it's we're members of the Ethical Trading Initiative, so that that's beneficial. But I can really see the benefit of joining up, you know, and I'm not, you know, so yeah, I mean, I think that would be really powerful if that can happen for those of us who might be buying similar things, you know, in those.
Fascinating subject. Pauline, coming back to you, if I may. Now, you know, in Sweden, you have a very sophisticated model, don't you, for organising sustainability issues in public procurement. Can you tell us a bit more about that and reflect, if you will, on opportunities for procurers from other sectors outside electronics, from how they could learn from the Electronics Watch model?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I really wish that Electronics Watch could like clone itself into Textile Watch or Food Watch, or, you know, because as you said, you know, we buy everything from footballs to MR cameras, and at the moment procurement officers are expected to address all these different sustainability issues in procurement, and so there are many synergies in doing this together, like cooperating. So like on a national level within these 21 regions, we have identified prioritized risk areas. We've done our due diligence on our risk categories. We developed like harmonized processes and routines, contract clauses, and we do joint follow-ups, because since we share the same supplier base throughout Sweden, you know, we can also co-finance these audits, and then, you know, the results are shared between all the regions. But as Tim was saying, the audit industry, the social audit industry, I mean, it's a big industry, and at the moment there are some critique, because these general audit schemes, they go in for a couple of days, they're going to cover so many areas, and sometimes it's very difficult to detect the specific risks that might be important in certain countries or in certain industries, so they might not even detect those kind of violations. So I think it's only within IT and our memberships through Electronics Watch that we have that expertise, and also the eyes and ears on the ground, and this information not being filtered through social audit reports. So yeah, there are a lot of benefits.
Great. Now, Mercè, if I can come to you, during the preparation for this, Björn, our director, told me that you'd started to discuss the idea of using the experiences of working with Electronics Watch in the development of future educational programs for administration staff in Catalonia. Can you tell us what you think the central points are that you'd like to see taken as lessons learned from your affiliation with Electronics Watch?
Yes, Andy. We do a lot of training, regular training for our public buyers. We have a lot of courses and training skills and a lot of workshops and different topics in public procurement. But we're thinking of the experience of Electronic Watch to show real cases and good practices perhaps that can help the public buyers to increase and to be more conscious about the need to introduce human rights clauses in the contracts, for example, and to be more transparent with all the manufacturing chain, for example. This is very important. The products that are not local products or non-manufactured in our country, but out of our borders, and to be conscious of the need of the social clauses and the respect for workers' conditions in those countries also. And I think this is very important. And I think working with good practices and real causes can make us more conscious. So we are working on these training programs.
Thanks, Mercè. Thank you, all of you, for talking about your experiences with Electronics Watch. I want to, for a moment, take a step back and look at affiliation with Electronics Watch. Now, the affiliation process as such is quite straightforward. The steps that internally need to be taken sometimes can be quite numerous, and it can take some time. Managers and colleagues need to be won over, and the general idea of sustainable or ethical procurement is still new. Budgets need to be drawn up, and all affected departments need to buy into the sustainability goals that go with such a decision. Now, Harpreet, if we can talk about those challenges of affiliation. Now, you're the newest staff member at Electronics Watch, and you've been working with the organization, but you have been working with the organization for quite some time, and you've got a huge experience of affiliating UK universities. Can you perhaps give us some insights into what it takes to convince procurers and administration in organizations to affiliate to Electronics Watch?
Sure, and I'll start with the best case scenario, and that is that you're speaking to an institution that has done its work on embedding sustainability into its practices. It's aware of its responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Sustainable Development Goals, and any kind of regional or domestic legislation that encourages sustainable procurement, and actively is looking for ways in which to address its risks. And so in that kind of context, it takes very little selling of the Electronics Watch model, because procurers can see the benefits of working with other public institutions and having the kind of on the ground intel that Pauline has described. I think more challenging scenarios arise when institutions maybe misunderstand what Electronics Watch does and how it differs from social auditing. And you've heard some of the speakers describe already the limitations of that, where auditors might go into a factory for a day. We've heard testimony of workers saying that they're given templates of how to respond to questions, and there's not really meaningful engagement about what their experiences are. And having to explain the worker-driven methodology and the benefits of that and the value added of that approach is often something that can take some time. Occasionally, there are still, unfortunately, some procurers that are unaware that they have a legal basis for doing this work, unfortunately, and can be quite concerned and reticent, and particularly, in the university sector where there have been lots of cuts, can feel concerned about undertaking work that potentially is going to add cost in a pressure where workplace pressures where they're encouraged to kind of reduce budget lines, and that's totally understandable, and working with them to kind of think about how sustainability is part of an essential component of their work can take some time. And then there are other kind of practical issues. An institution might be right in the middle of having tendered for a contract and wants to incorporate electronic watch contract terms, but wants to wait until that period has completed before engaging with electronic watch. And occasionally we're able to work with institutions and say, well, there's lots we can work with you in terms of industry engagement, even if you are in the middle of the contract. And that is something that you know, we have discussions with them on, and trying to convince them that sometimes having that lead-in time is actually really beneficial, to have the industry engagement and get the market aware that these conditions are coming down the line. And I think the last thing that I wanted to say is that electronics watch contract terms ask for a lot of suppliers. They have justifiably, in my view, lots of requirements around transparency, location, and engagement for you know, sending reports. And I think some institutions can be a bit concerned if they're buying through resellers, what leverage those resellers have. And can be sometimes concerned about the benefits that might accrue. And I think, again, showing that the work that some resellers have done to work with brands and manufacturers, and that we have had important movements from the market, even working with resellers, again, can take time, that cooperative approach can really show improvements throughout the supply chain. And that when we do find violations, we're not going to go straight to terminating a contract, but that we do have a very cooperative approach with the industry to drive improvements that are often quite systemic. But I've spoken a lot, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Harpreet, for your insights. They're really useful. I want to go back, bring the panel back in now. Tim, as I remember, Transport for London led, if you like, for the Greater London Authority family, didn't it, in affiliating with this watch? And you, I'm sure, will experience how challenging that process of affiliation could be internally in your organisation, but still managed to become one of the founding members of Electronics Watch. How do you remember that process, Tim?
It was. I think our initial engagement with Jim Cranshaw, who some of you know, who was at People and Planet at the time, who I think were partnering with Electronics Watch in the early day. I mean, still with now, but so it was initial engagement with him really, and I don't think I knew very much about it really, and I think he approached us and sort of felt that we would be a good kind of founding affiliate, which I certainly agreed with once I could have understood. Took a bit of time to sort of understand it. It was sort of early days and took a bit of time for me to sort of get to grips with what it was. But as I said, it certainly kind of was a presentation of a solution to a problem which we'd been grappling with for quite some time, of this lack of leverage and lack of ability to engage with the electronics industry. But we know that finances are tight, and finances all the tighter now in TfL, for anyone who might be reading about that in the media, but due to recent situation. But even back then, the public sector finances, particularly in London, have always been a challenge. So I suppose it was a two-prong, well, sort of, it was just really around kind of articulating that it was a solution to a problem that existed, that we were exposed, that there was challenges and risks in our supply chain that were not being addressed and wouldn't really be addressed unless we were able to join an organisation like this. I'd say I should choose my words somewhat carefully, but I think ultimately probably the learning point from that and other experiences over my career is ultimately the political will trump the financial. And I could say political with a small p as much as a big P for those for people listening here, depending on how writ large that is in your own organisations. But I suppose making a business case is really important. So you can sort of set what Electronics Watch do against whatever you might be able to do yourself, and how much more resource and cost you'd have to put towards that to actually have an impact. But actually, really making the case for the fact that we are exposed. There's a reputational risk. There's a political risk that these issues will land. The scrutiny is there, and not last but not least in that pot of kind of drivers is, of course, it's the right thing to do, and as an organisation that had quite some time before that set it stalled out all the publicly published ethical sourcing policy, and saying that we take these things seriously, that we care about this is a priority for us. To sort of say all that and then say, well, actually, but we're not going to try to do anything about electronics, and we're not going to take this opportunity. That doesn't really add up. So those are sorts of some of the arguments. It was a fair effort. I won't lie about that. Just that persuasion. It's a hierarchical organisation, as I'm sure lots of most large public sector organisations are. So you end up having to make the case a number of times. That means you kind of get a bit better at it each time, in theory. And then I think, just sort of for those listening, if this is a factor for you, sort of identify the political strings that might be able to be pulled, and it might not be appropriate for you to do that, but it might be that there's other people operating outside the organisation who might be able to exert some influence as well. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully people kind of understand what I'm pointing towards.
Thanks, Tim. Mercè, with a regional government in Catalonia, not only is size the question, but there are even more complexities, aren't there, as democratic institutions and procedures need to be followed. Who was the driver behind the idea of affiliating the Catalan government to Electronics Watch, and how long did it take?
Well, it takes a long period of time, more than 6 months. About 6-7 months, because when we start the process of affiliation, we have in mind that it must cover all the administration, all the bodies, all public sector, not only 1 or 2 departments, but all of them. So we have to talk with a lot of institutions implied, with jurisdiction over different aspects of the affiliation. For example, we have a central body that is the central buyer for all the electronic products, but there are other agencies that also have their own jurisdiction to buy some products, electronic products. So we have to talk with all of them, not only with the central body. And who started all the process was the International Cooperation Agency, the Catalan International Cooperation Agency. It's an agency that has a lot of agreements in different countries of the world to help in international cooperation with different entities or non-governmental entities, and they develop several programs on different countries. And so they start all the process, but they don't have jurisdiction over public procurement. So they talk with me, and I start all the process with the public procurement sector. So there were a lot of institutions that has to do their internal procedures. So it was really complicated, complicated. And finally, we signed an agreement with Electronic Watch. And this agreement, I think it's a very good agreement that we have signed, and has all the includes everyone, all the public administration of the public sector, and it's mandatory for everyone. And I am very proud of the clauses we have put in this agreement and all the support we received from Electronic Watch. So, but it was very complicated, I have to say this.
Björn Claeson, Director of Electronics Watch, you were the counter-signatory for that agreement with the Catalan government. What's your most vivid memory of that process?
Let me say first that 6 to 7 months for a large institution like the Catalan government is super fast. But if I were to single out the most vivid memory that I have from this process, it's the public announcement of the affiliation at the Electronics Watch annual conference that we held in Barcelona in December of 2019. We were really honored to have the Vice President, Pere Aragonés, to make the announcement at the conference. And what I remember the most, I think, is because this sort of happened at the, it wasn't like we had months and months of preparation. So it was, we received instructions about how to handle this at the last moments. And I do remember This had to be very carefully scripted. It had to be choreographed. We had to go and meet the vice president at the entrance doors. Then we had to go behind the scenes, wait until the right moment, and then enter the scenes through a sort of side entrance. And there we were part of a panel, and the vice president made his announcement. But what I actually really liked about that, and what I remember about that, is this type of carefully scripted choreography lent a sense of formality and some gravitas to the whole event, which I think is very, very appropriate when you discuss serious issues. Human rights, modern slavery, environmental degradation, the role of public procurement in this process. So I think it really set the perfect tone for the whole conference.
Now, in Electronics Watch, we're a large collaboration, aren't we, of large and small affiliates. And the small ones are just as important to us, aren't they?
Absolutely.
What's the difference in the affiliation process between a big entity like a regional government and a small district local authority, let's say?
Yeah. Well, let me provide a caveat first. I've never worked for a public organization. And I think these processes can vary from organization to organization quite a bit, from country to country, of course. But so from a rather limited perspective, what we have seen is that what Harpreet was talking about earlier, when in the ideal scenario with a smaller organization, they can express interest. We can say, okay, well, here's an offer, and a month later they're affiliated. That can happen. That actually does not go that quickly very often, but it can happen. With a larger organization, I think both the procurement and the politics becomes much more complex. I'd look at it in 3 or 4 different phases. The first phase, of course, is basically where we do outreach and education to an institution. In the case of the Catalan government, we worked hand in hand with the NGO SITEM, and they were really doing a lot of that initial outreach and education with the government, participating in events, set up meetings, and so on. So then you get to the stage where they say, okay, yeah, we're interested, but then it's a discussion on what can we offer? What is the affiliation offer? What benefits can we provide? And what are their responsibilities as an affiliate? And in this case, with a large organization, our affiliation fees are tied to the value of ICT hardware procurement. With a large organization, such as the Catalan government, it can be very difficult actually to know exactly how much do all these dozens of institutions that are part of the government procure. So that takes a little bit of time sometimes to even come up with an estimate. But then you've done that. Then I think you enter also a political phase sometimes. And that can take long, because sometimes you have to wait for the right political moment to actually affiliate, because these large organizations, of course, they have any number of policy objectives. Can be affected by crisis, or that divert energies in different directions. COVID is an absolutely perfect example of that, of course. And then there are sometimes inter-organizational relationships that we have no insight into, but that also impacts the sort of political alignment. So there has to be there has to be an internal discussion, there has to be a political alignment. And then it can happen. And after that, after affiliation, the next phase, which is very, very important, is the whole organizational buy-in. So the key people, particularly in procurement, need to understand how can they use the tools that we provide to create added value for them. How can we help them solve, achieve their own policy objectives? And so that's the next phase, to create that kind of complete buy-in within the organization.
Björn, I want to take our discussion forward as time ticks on to supply chain transparency. Now, as you will know, the Electronics Watch model just can't function without transparency of supply chains. And And after joining, that would probably be the most important step that affiliates can take. Can you tell us a bit more about what supply chain transparency is and how establishing the supply chain transparency is situated in the whole electronics watch process of monitoring?
Sure. I think, first of all, transparency, of course, is the foundation to drive change in the supply chain and improve conditions for workers and to stop environmental degradation. But I think maybe it would make sense to think about transparency from three different perspectives. One is a public buyer. Second is the supplier or the brand that supplies the public buyer. And the third is the employer or the factory where the workers are. And each one of them can have an important role in supply in transparency. It really starts with affiliation. Shortly after affiliation, we need to know what you're buying. If we don't know what you're buying, if we don't know what the products that you're buying, we can't monitor. So that's it's not always easy, but it's a process that public buyers are in control of, to simply report the product models that you buy. If we know that, we already have pretty good idea of where and sometimes the actual factories where those products could be made. But the next step involves the supplier to you, your supplier, your contractor, and the brands. And that is that we would like them to report to you, the public buyer, exactly what factories are these products made in. Where are they assembled, but also where are the most important components of those products made. And indeed, we try to push it as far up the supply chain as possible, because we need to shed light on in the part of the supply chain where the conditions are really the worst, which is not tier 1, but it's tier 2, tier 3, and beyond. So the supplier's responsibility is really fundamental to us being, supplier transparency and brand transparency is fundamental to us being able to monitor and to be able to work together with these companies to drive change in supply chain. Now, the workplace itself, the factory itself that's being monitored, also has an incredibly important role to play here, because when we're talking about driving change, we were talking from a work, and using the worker-driven monitoring methodology, it is really important that workers themselves have a seat at the table, so to speak, to discuss, to not just to report the issues that they face, but also to say, hey, I think we can do it this way. I think this is a good solution. And when you talk to workers, they have all kinds of good ideas. They're willing to compromise. They're willing to say, we can do this so that this can happen. And so giving workers the space and the resources really to participate in those discussions about remediation is an incredibly important part of transparency as well. If all those three aspects, the public buyer, the companies, the brands, and the factories are able to push transparency in this way, then we're very far along towards creating more sustainable and resilient supply chains.
Great. Pauline, can I bring you in at this point? Because
Yeah.
I know that you are, as a practitioner, you're certainly one of Sweden's leading practitioners in supply chain transparency, if not a leader in Europe on supply chain transparency. And so tell us, please, what role does it play for you? And in the Stockholm region, how does managing to establish supply chain transparency play for you?
Right. I mean, as Björn was saying, transparency is obviously the key here. And I had a chat with my colleague Catalan on this. And I mean, obviously, we've been using award criteria for traceability in almost all IT procurement since 2018, where we ask name and addresses for factories, for final production, also for certain high-risk components. But we also know that supply chains are dynamic. So that means that the information you receive maybe during the tender phase or during the start of the contract might not be the same as during the contract period. So maybe one of the points of the award criteria is maybe not to identify low risk factories, but check the willingness to be transparent at the supplier base for our suppliers. So, and to be quite honest, I mean, at the moment, Kathleen hardly dares to ask anymore, because if the answer is Xinjiang, she cannot do anything about it, because we are so dependent. And the issue in China now with the Uyghur situation, I mean, that's kind of terrible. So what we have started to do now is also to include traceability requirements in the agreement, so we can get like a list of factors during the contract period, which is actually updated annually, because these supply chains, they change all the time. So yeah, but obviously transparency is key here.
And what about you, Tim? How is, to what extent is supply chain transparency important in the GLA family, and how did you manage to establish it?
Yeah, I mean, it's vitally important. You know, for us, you know, as others here, you know, we're sort of at the top of the heap. So we're the buyers, and we've got long supply chains below us. But so we're the ones with the, I guess, the name recognition. Transport for London's pretty well known, as I mentioned. The mayor of London, certainly lots of scrutiny. So whether these issues are happening, you know, in tier 1 or tier 5 or whatever it might be, you know, occasionally we're buying from relatively well-known companies, and obviously some of the ICT hardware we buy is from the name brand recognition. But so many of our suppliers are companies that public and the press won't have heard of, really. So, you know, the buck stops with us, really, as the money comes from us and the responsibility lies with us. So the only way to be able to enact that responsibility is to understand what's going on in our supply chains via transparency initiatives. So it's vitally important for those reasons. We I guess we have a combination. I won't go into a lot of detail now. I know time's short, but of course we use Electronics Watch. I briefly mentioned SEDEX. It's another useful system that we can use to sort of map supply chains and get information around specific sites of supply. Sometimes we sort of do it manually, if you like. Sometimes it's not all that sophisticated as it might be. So there's a few tools in the arsenal, if you like. But yeah, certainly the Electronics Watch approach, I'd say, is the most mature and the most cohesive, and the one that we're sharing with you know, obviously affiliates around Europe and I think the world now, and in many ways the most powerful.
And right across London, you're involved in dozens of different procurement categories. How do you go about implementing supply chain transparency as a practice across such a broad range of categories?
Yeah, I mean, we have to start by doing some hot spotting, so some risk analysis and kind of really understanding where the risks are, and then kind of apportioning resources such that we're focusing. So we started a number of years ago, as you mentioned, on uniforms, knowing that, you know, with Bangladesh and China, very high risk there, and then we're looking at stone for construction sites, and we're looking at electronics, of course, and looking at steel. So we sort of bite off areas as we go and kind of move on to the next one once we sort of got to grips with something. That it's never complete, of course, but you know, move on and kind of try to tackle those high risk areas first. But there's of course the unknown unknowns, we don't know. And I guess one thing I didn't mention at the beginning, but I think it was mentioned by others, is one of the benefits of Electronics Watch is myself and my team. You know, we can't be experts in everything. We're hopefully experts in responsible, sustainable procurement, but we can't be experts in electronics and stone and garments and everything necessarily. So being able to partner with organizations that do have experts or access to experts, that's really helpful for us, so that we don't have to try to understand everything ourselves, because that's probably impossible.
And Mercè, in Catalonia, supply chain transparency must be a cornerstone of the work that you do. What sort of challenges have you had in implementing it?
We have a lot of challenges, because we are trying to implement the transparency in the supply chain, also in electronic products, but also in fabrics for uniforms or whatever. And we have a lot of problems because we have local products, so it's easy to make them transparent, but when fabrics are not produced in the country, it's very difficult. And we are trying we have not the solution yet, but we are working on some model clauses in the contracts to be sure that we can guarantee this transparency. And in other products, for example, in health products, mask, for example, in 2020 with all the pandemic, we have to buy a lot of masks, and we buy a lot of them out of our borders in China or whatever. Now they're local suppliers, and so it's easy to make them accomplish some requirements. But it has not been easy because we have to work with a lot of different cases, and we are working on models to have some model clauses in this kind of products, for example. But there are a lot of products that in some cases is very, very difficult to make this transparency really transparent, because there are a lot of aspects that you cannot control through public procurement. And so you have to think a lot how to make at least the most important aspects of the manufacturing process, like conditions workers or some kind of clauses. But there are a lot, it implies a lot in all the manufacturing process.
Thanks, Mercè. We're coming to the end of our session, everybody, now, and it's been fascinating to hear about your electronics watch journeys, and I know that you've all achieved quite a bit more than you've had time to tell us about you through your affiliation with Electronics Watch, and we're going to go into a bit more detail, I think, in the second of this series. But in one sentence, starting with you, Mercè, in one sentence, tell us what's been your proudest achievement with Electronics Watch so far.
In one sentence, I am proud of increase the social compromise with human rights in transparency in public procurement. And
Tim, what would yours be?
I think it was when we finally got our main ICT hardware contract came up for renewal. It was a little while after our affiliation, and it's a reseller contract. So we put the EW clauses in. I was very much expecting pushback, challenges from the bidders, and nothing. You know, they all accepted the clauses, all the bidders accepted them, and it went in. And that was a happy surprise. And I think down to a lot of the work that Peter and the other Electronics Watch team members did in terms of the bidding process, supporting us in that and market engagement. So that, I don't know, yeah, that was just a really happy surprise.
Great. Pauline, last but not least.
Thanks. I'm not going to say proudest. I think we are constant or continuous proud members of Electronics Watch. I think because, you know, they together with their monitoring partners, they open up the electronics industry to these independent inspections, and also helps us to bring workers out of that bondage forced labor and create really safer workplace. So, you know, we are continuous proud members.
Thanks. And Gemma, I think my favorite experience with Electronics Watch was when I worked in the UK higher education sector, and we managed to, and we wouldn't have been able to do this without Electronics Watch support, but we managed to get some students in Guangdong province freed from a forced labor situation where they were making our servers in a factory and working under what were menaces, I think. And I think we managed to sort of, couldn't have done it without Electronics Watch. Gemma, over to you to wrap up. You're on mute.
Okay, of course, the mute dragon. Okay, so thanks so much, Andy. That's it, we have come to a close. I think it was a really fascinating and candid insight into why you've all affiliated, how you did it, what difference it makes to you. And so really just left for me to say a really big thank you to our audience for joining us today, to our panelists, to you, our host, Andy, and also to Electronics Watch staff who do such a fantastic job making Electronics Watch the effective NGO that it is as Andy said, there will be a second follow-up one, which will really go into the detail about how have those changes occurred for the lives of workers. And after that, I think, you know, it's going to be a great recorded history that will hopefully inspire and enable many more public sector bodies to affiliate to Electronics Watch, and certainly for our members and our representatives at UNISON to help to be part of that journey. So a very big thank you to everybody who's been part of this.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.